Today, Brian and I are back with Michael Knight. Michael has joined us numerous times over the past year, kicked us off last year talking about some of the 2020 trends that we would see in the electronics industry. And now we are back to look into 2021. How are you, Michael?
Doing great. I'm healthy and employed, which is not nothing these days. So I'm in good shape. How are you guys doing?
Pretty good.
Yeah, we're doing good. It's been an interesting year, but
Yes.
we're doing
Yes.
good.
We are also healthy and employed, so we are blessed. But it has been quite a year. And I know you joined us mid-year to talk about nearshoring and offshoring. And I know that's something that I want to revisit today. But, how has 2020 been for TTI this year? How have, that's obviously there's no mistake, and the pandemic has played a role in everything. How have things gone for you over there?
Actually, all things considering, remarkably well. So we're in the electronic component supply chain, and we're global, and we're involved in lots of different end market segments. So diversity, of course, always helps. But by and large, and I think I'm going to speak not just for TTI, but for the electronic component industry overall, this year has actually been better than I think most people expected, in the midst of the pandemic. But as I constantly remind everybody, we had a great year shaping up in Q1. There was a lot of very obvious and positive trends pushing the industry along going into 2020. And the fact of the matter is, if COVID hadn't come along, this would have been a banner year for the industry. So in my opinion, what's happened with COVID is I don't think it's fundamentally unraveled the things behind, the underlying things behind the strength of the industry. I think it just kind of pushed out the realization of those things. So what we saw specifically at TTI was obviously by March, when the World Health Organization finally said, "Hey, this is real. Everybody get prepared to hunker down." Things hit a wall pretty quickly. But then what we experienced as an industry, and certainly saw at TTI, is started recovering from that by May, June. It became obvious that the industry was going to push through it. So we have been experiencing recovery and growing momentum in our business in the second half of the year. And I think that's pretty universal. So punchline is we're expecting to finish calendar 2020 from a revenue standpoint actually a little bit ahead of 2019.
Wow.
So I think that speaks a lot to fundamentally what's going on in technology's role in the world. So yeah, it's been interesting, but overall, this has not been a write-off year for us.
Right. That's awesome to hear. And I think you're right. Diversity plays such a key role, in it. Here's a question, right? Do you think that the industry, like the electronics industry, right, it's so ingrained in everything that I don't want to say it's on autopilot, but it's almost like when you have these big events, it doesn't slow it down as much as we would normally have thought it would have in the past, because the industry is pretty much in everything.
It is. Well, it's all relative to where we were 10 years ago. It's come a long way in terms of creeping into kind of every nook and corner of our life. But the exciting thing about it going forward is there's still a long way to go. There are still an awful lot of places that technology hasn't really inserted itself. So I recently visited my primary doctor for annual checkup. There's no automation in his records. There's no there's no use of computerized note taking.
Right.
Nothing. It's the opportunity for technology is is massive in terms of the future. But one of the things I will say, actually, I think a lot of us discovered about the pandemic is that it's accelerated the trends, some of the technology trends and the adoption and actually the interest in some of the stuff that's coming. So, all of a sudden 5G, which has, been in the works now for a while, everybody's talking about 5G, and the other thing I would say about technology relative to the pandemic is, imagine where we would have been if this had hit us 5 years ago, or, hit us in 2015 when Bill Gates was talking about it, right? We would have been in a lot more trouble economically. We were here at TTI able to push everybody into working remotely, except for in the warehouses, very, very quickly because of the state of technology and availability of the missing pieces that we didn't have. So, long and short of it is, after some turmoil because of the uncertainty in the middle of the year, a lot of businesses, especially in our industry, kind of got back into the swing of things with people working remotely, and that's all thanks to the current state of technology. So what the pandemic has done, in my opinion, is kind of accelerated some trends that were already in place prior to it arriving.
Would you say that there were any industries in particular that saw a significant uptick as a result of the pandemic in the electronic space?
Or that were even surprising, like this
Right,
sort of
or
surprised
something
you,
that,
like,
I'm wondering, I wonder what contributed, obviously what contributes to the success. And Brian mentioned things like, technologies and everything, and we talked about accelerating the trends, but was there anything that was kind of directly impacted in a positive way in the industry?
Yeah, and it's all stuff in hindsight that actually is, I guess, pretty obvious. But certainly the medical technology sector, elements of that got a real boom from this. But this overall IoT thing also saw a big boost because what we have is there's everything's remote now. Touchless is a big thing. All this stuff lends itself well to the deployment of sensors and then connecting those sensors wirelessly through, narrow band or 4G or LoRa, the different wireless protocols. But obviously we saw a huge uptick in demand for notebook computers, servers. The mobile phones have done well. All the personal networking stuff has done well. I mean, for a big part of this year, the lead times on like Logitech cameras were through the roof. And then there were things that I think have done well that were surprising to your question, like appliances, for instance. Lead times on refrigerators and things went through the roof, and that's not one that I would have seen or figured out in advance.
right?
Looking backwards, it starts to become kind of obvious, and part of it is related to disruptions in the supply chain, and there's certainly been a ton of that. Not all COVID related this year, but there's been an outsized amount of supply chain disruption this year. And some of it's demand. As people are using their time at home to kind of retool their living spaces and upgrade and starting to move households as they figure out that they may be able to work remotely long term. And the common denominator through all this is all of this stuff is using more and more electronic components than it did, even a year or two ago. So they're starting to talk about or promote refrigerators as the digital hub for your house.
Yeah.
Who would have ever seen that coming, right?
Yeah. I mean, when we were kids, just imagine going, there's going to be a screen in my refrigerator, like you would have never thought about that, right?
Yeah, and sensors, keeping track of your, milk usage and number of eggs and
right.
Yeah, and then starting to nag you to get more. I mean,
That's
it's-
right.
I have a child to nag me for things like that. I don't
Right. It's like more fruit snacks, more Oreos, yeah. It's crazy.
So,
I'll tell you a funny story. Actually, I actually one of my MacBook Pro sort of had a little issue during COVID, and I went to I had to go to the Mac store. They were like, yeah, they're about 8 weeks out, to even order one, to even stock,
yeah.
So everything, to your point, Michael, has gotten got so pushed out, like you said, even the cameras, it's crazy. Anything that was sort of home based business or
Right.
for the home became a rough one.
Yeah,
Even
and I think
outside of the industry.
I think the big story in 2021 actually, as we start to recover, well, actually recovery's already started, is going to be further disruption caused by extended lead times and shortages in all kinds of components. Because one of the other things that has happened in 2020 that in hindsight is pretty obvious is CapEx spending hit the wall. Everybody dialed back on CapEx spending. And, in uncertain times makes perfect sense, right?
Mhm.
But it does put you behind when things become more certain. And so what we're seeing right now is demand picks up, and some of it's catch-up demand, some of it's just a return back to the trend that existed pre-COVID that I was talking
Mhm.
about earlier. We're seeing lead times and all kinds of things push out, and there's growing chatter in the industry about this, and that we're going to see in high-end micros and MOSFETs and ceramic capacitors and all kinds of things, some difficulty in getting parts um, as business bounces back next year. And that it's I guess kind of a high class problem, but a problem number nonetheless, because that's makes for a very uneven flow of material through the supply chain, which in and of itself can undermine companies' performance and undermine a company's ability to deliver why that uh, why that normalizes. So I think 2021's by almost everybody's account these days is going to be a pretty decent up year, but it's not going to be a smooth and to the right kind of climb. It's going to be tricky.
Why are things taking, why the long lead times? I mean, the supply chain, yes, but the what is taking so long? I don't understand.
It's caution. So companies are slow to commit to the additional capacity, which makes the companies who have to put that capacity in place slow to commit to the capex to put it in place. It is, oddly enough, things like availability of labor and machine time to put this stuff together has been constrained for quite a while. Um, and I've talked about this a bunch over the last couple of years. In our industry in particular, where margins have gone, it's made it very hard for companies to double down and add more capacity at current price points. So,
Mm.
especially in passive components, what we saw in 2018 was largely due to the fact that if you're not making money or you're hardly making any money on what you're already building, why would you spend more money to build more of that?
Mhm.
And so what happened in 2018 was demand greatly exceeded capacity. And uh, in hindsight, it looks like what the supplier community did was sit tight and let the shortages push prices up to the point where it now became economically viable to add more capacity. And then we started seeing capacity come in, and parts started to flow again. In 2019, we were getting kind of back on track, and then bam, 2020 hit. So, COVID-19 has been like this this fog, right? You can't see anything coming at you, good or bad. And so I honestly, I think what we will experience in 2020 will feel a bit like 2018 for a lot of the same reasons. So it's like everything these days, it's a complicated answer. So that means there's no easy solution.
Mm. Well, let's look ahead, right? Last year we talked about 5G, and 5G was kind of that buzzword, and you've mentioned it again today. Is there a word of 2021?
Oh boy, is there a word for
Oh,
2021?
What
a
are we
word
looking?
for
I mean, other than
technology.
I could think of some words, but that's
Right.
not what I
Better,
meant.
better. It's going better.
Yeah,
2021.
Better. That's the word of
Better.
2021.
maybe
Yeah.
resumption, or a phrase, the grande non-fat latte breaks the $5 mark in 2021. Yeah, I think 2021, maybe the word is, and I perhaps if I used this before, is exponential. And because the journey we're on with technology um, is is getting more and more interesting. And the reason it's getting more and more interesting is it's accelerating. And in an exponential curve, the really interesting thing about it is the first half of the curve basically looks and feels linear. So you think, this is just kind of the standard, progression, a very, uh, you know, 45-degree or less up and to the right kind of thing. The second half of the curve, though, is when things go completely haywire and start to expand very, very rapidly, of an exponential curve. And I have been thinking, and I'm not alone in this, and I'm not an original thinker in this, honestly, but that the 2020s were going to be when we moved into the second half of the exponential technology curve. So if you accept the fact that technology is exponential, then all of a sudden, a lot of the stuff that's going on right now, and a lot of how businesses have been able to react to COVID, and what's going on with like vaccine development, quantum computing, and the implications for developing new medicines. All of this stuff all of a sudden starts to kind of come together, and you begin to get a sense of what's ahead of us, and how different it is than what's behind us, and how quickly those differences are going to come up upon us. So I think the 2020s are going to be, we're going to look back on the 2020s, and it's going to be very obvious that this is when, and this is going to sound very grandiose, but this is when human society, human evolution took the next big leap forward. At 2030, when we look back, our life and how we live and how we operate is going to look, in my opinion, very different than it did at the beginning of 2020. And technology has an oversized role in all of that.
Mhm. So I know we were sort of at the point in place, right? Like it's got to that point. And do you think, just COVID just really helped push it over the edge, like gave it that little, kick that it needed, just because we now needed to do those things in order to continue? Like people got more motivated by, okay, we're working from home, we have this different lifestyle, that it accelerated it.
Yeah, it definitely put a lot of back pressure on certain areas, and created a lot of additional energy for things like I mentioned AI in medicine, and so AI has been very instrumental in quickly running down new compounds to try. And quantum computing, which is probably a mid-decade thing in terms of it starting to mainstream, is going to accelerate all of that exponentially. There's that word again. Because, when you think about it, just to talk a little bit more about medicine, how this is advanced through our history has been very much kind of trial and error. So even in recent times, how new medicines are developed is you try things, you mix something up, see what happens. Mix something else up, you make a little tweak, see what happens, and you start to make connection points. Even when medicine is being prescribed to us as individuals, oftentimes what happens is, hey, okay, you're developing a little high blood pressure. Now there's 3 or 4 different families of things we can try. Let's try this one and this particular dose and see what happens. Okay, that didn't really get us where we wanted to be. So we'll try a different dose. Still not there. So let's try a different family. So it's very, very experimental. And so what's going to happen with medicine development is that with the quantum computing in particular, you're going to be able to run through lots and lots of variations very, very quickly and be able to really advance the modeling aspect of pharmaceutical development. But what's going to make it much more effective is the fact that with quantum computing, you can now all of a sudden take into account the subatomic randomness that underlies, the material properties of all the different molecules that you're studying. So, in medicine, you're looking at how different molecules interact, and quantum computing is going to be able to get down much deeper than that. So you're going to be able to make those connections, learn much, much faster. And then how that translates into us individually is, with how the cost of being able to map our genome has basically collapsed from, it wasn't that long ago. It was over $1 million, and now it's under $1,000. So we're going to be able to, one, understand ourselves at a molecular level, and then understand how all these different properties, all these different medicines and foods and all this other stuff that we ingest, how that intersects with, interacts with us at a molecular level. And so everything's going to get much more precise. And that's it's a kind of a long, complicated example, but these are the kinds of things, to your very first question, Brian, where technology is, working its way in at a faster and faster level, but maybe even more importantly, at a deeper and deeper level. That is, as I said a minute ago, going to lead to some really transformative stuff, in terms of us living longer, living better, being more mobile. It's just, literally, we could talk for days and probably not even come close to getting to all the different things that are possible, in the course of the next 10 years.
Now, you also mentioned AI, right? So, we talked a lot about like quantum computing, and here's breaking down the data and understanding everything and making those compounds and seeing how they react. Is AI almost going to start really providing the analysis for us on top of that?
Yeah, it already is. It's accelerated the learning process. So, analysis is certainly a big part of that. So, and but AI still has yet to, in a way, mainstream. It's still very much in its infancy. We're not anywhere close to the singularity where, a computer with AI becomes as smart as a human being, and then becomes self-aware, and then we're all, potentially doomed. So there's a lot to go, but AI is certainly a big piece of the future, and it's also it's a really interesting thing in that, who's gonna dominate in AI? Is it going to be the U.S.? Is it going to be China? what was it, a couple of years ago, uh, Putin said something along the lines of, whoever dominates AI is going to dominate the world. And certainly what we've seen the last couple of years in China, there's a hyper focus on AI investment related to that premise. And this, I'm going to wander off course here for a minute, but it's also one of the things that I think is most pressing in the U.S. and in terms of. So one of the things that I've seen happen in my career in the U.S. is the federal government used to invest a lot in core innovation, core research. DARPA was famous for being the incubator for all kinds of technologies that then later on mainstream. NASA as well. When you think about the space program, all of the stuff that came out of that, all the technology, modern electronics was birthed in this space program. But what's happened over time is now the federal government isn't that active. It's basically given control of all of that to private industry. Private industry has picked that up to the point now that private industry is driving, next generation space exploration. That's something that, until recently was dominated by first world governments. So what's happening is we've got this situation where when private industry is doing something, it's optimized for the company or the individual doing it, not optimized necessarily for society. And the Chinese have seized upon this, and the Chinese are very involved with tech innovation in their country and within their society. And I think we've got some catching up to do there. I'm not one of those people that thinks that China is going to supplant us. I'm actually one of those people that is hoping that collectively we have more commonality than differences, and that we can get back to globalizing, which this whole notion of globalization has been one of the things that suffered in the pandemic, and suffered in the current political environment, not just here in the US, but all over the world. So, I think that the secret to a more prosperous future for all of us is all of us working together. And to bring this back to AI, AI certainly plays a role in that. If you have AI, if you have a Chinese AI and you have a US AI, that doesn't help. I think that actually moves us more along the path of nationalization, isolationism, and globalization. So this is going to be pretty interesting. The other thing that I see going on right now related to all this, and I want to come back to something else before I forget it, but is that we have because of all of this, I feel like what is developing here is a tech war. So that's
I was going to ask you about
masquerading.
that.
Yeah, it's
Because I
masquerading.
saw that today on LinkedIn. Yeah.
Okay, so it's masquerading a bit as a trade war, and in fact, I think that tariffs and things have become actually a weapon, and maybe that's what I put in. Is that you might be referring to?
Mhm. Yep.
I commented on something about tariffs being
Japan.
weaponized. in the
There
tech
was
war.
an article about Japan, correct?
Yeah. So I think we've got a tech war developing here, and that's unfortunate, and we've got to get on top of that. And then this kind of relates to something that I wanted to say, that is that part of the solution to this is the U.S., in my opinion, needs a chief technology officer, and we've had it. We've had a chief technology officer in the past. I don't remember her name, Megan something, maybe Megan Smith, under the Obama administration. Really, really bright lady, MIT, Google, we need a chief technology officer. And in my opinion, I think it needs to be a cabinet level position, because this is tricky stuff to navigate. And it really does have a huge bearing on the future, the prosperity of the U.S. And the fact of the matter is, federal government is an institution. All governments really are institutions that predate technology, and so there's a gap there. And you need some really smart technologists who are not operating for an individual company, but that are operating for the population in the mix. And so I've decided that every chance I have to promote the idea of a CTO, cabinet level CTO, I'm going to do it.
Maybe it could be Michael Knight. I don't know.
That's right.
We'll
That's
we'll
right.
recommend you.
Michael, if you run for it and I get to vote on that, I will vote for you.
Well, I appreciate it, but I'll tell you, I'll disqualify myself because it's so important, and I'm just nibbling at the edges of this stuff. I mean, we need people involved who really understand how all of this works and can kind of pull it together. I honestly, who I would, if this was something that we got to vote for, who I would vote for is Bill Gates. I think he touches everything and has a great way of understanding how it all interrelates and then translating that into something that's human.
I want to go back. I want to ask about this tech war, though. Do you think that it's similar to the space race in a way, of years ago?
I do. That's a really great observation. Yes, this is, in fact, we're having Sputnik moments, left, right, and center in this tech war. Yes, and the underlying drivers and motivators are very much the same. And I think too, being an optimist, I think the outcomes can be very similar, because that space race actually drove a lot of really interesting innovation and transformation.
Absolutely.
I wonder what we can. That's what I would love for this new position that you've created for the country to do, is really, what can we take away from that? What can we learn, since we've kind of been through this already as a country? How can we apply what we've learned to present times?
I just have one request, though. If we do get this person, can they fix it so you could actually do stuff at the DMV much quicker?
That's even harder than getting a man on the moon, Brian. I don't know.
Hey, I think I would ask them, job number one, let's have really reliable, crystal clear mobile phone service every place in the U.S.
Yes.
No,
Forget other countries.
Yeah, that'd be a win.
Yeah.
I just want to go in my basement. That's all.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Oh man.
It's there's so much opportunity here in everything that we're talking about, but there's also loads of risk. And one of the things, unfortunately, that happens when times are good is we stop thinking about risk. It's dealing with risk. It's expensive. It takes resource, and it's like having an insurance. If you knew you were never going to have to use your insurance policy, you would drop your insurance in a nanosecond.
Mhm.
And so, what happens when in times of prosperity is we stop thinking about, all the risks. And the reality is the risk profile for businesses around the world is increasing very, very quickly. You have climate-based or weather-based risk. That's this is it. COVID's dominated the headlines in 2020, but the supply chain disruptions related to weather, I think, are going to prove to be in 2020 bigger than they were even in 2019. In 2019, the economic damage done to business by weather events was exceeded $150 billion. So that's one of the other things that COVID's done, is we tend to focus, and we're like a cat with a laser. All we see is that the COVID dot moving around. And there's a lot of other things at play here, but so we've got a lot of work to do to weatherproof our supply chains, to risk-proof all of this great potential that we're talking about, because if we don't do that, we could find ourselves continually blindsided by things like COVID and that's the reality of the world. And maybe the last point I'll make on that is, the fact of the matter is, most of our supply chains were designed, developed, constructed in the 80s. And they too don't take full advantage of modern technology, nor have they been sensitized to the growing disruptive nature of weather events, disruption of cybersecurity, et cetera, right? So.
The 80s, wow. Nobody did anything differently since.
Yeah. No,
sorry,
I'm jumping around.
No. I think most people didn't even realize we had a record hurricane season this year. It was so hidden in the news.
That exactly. That is exactly the point. Yeah.
But that's weather. I mean, how do you weatherproof something? I mean, is it a matter of having alternate routes, alternate facilities, alternate, what is that solution? How do you deal with Mother Nature?
Yeah. So, therein lies the dilemma, in that the best way to do it is have, as you point out, multiple sources, multiple facilities in different parts of the world. But that flies in the face of the best way to do it from a profit maximization standpoint, or cost minimization standpoint, maybe is a better way of looking at it. What we've done is we've centralized, so best example is the factory fire at AKM in Japan. So this one facility, it burned for, I don't know, a couple, 3 days, and destroyed everything, including the masks in there. And it's a semiconductor fab. And they produced the vast majority of the silicon for timing devices, for some digital to analog converters, some really core technology that's important in 5G and loads of things. So fire happens, and as it's starting to wind down, the world is starting to realize that, holy crap, we, in our supply chain, not first tier, maybe not even second tier, but we are really dependent upon that one spot on Earth. And there's plenty of this, and we ended up that way because that's a really efficient way to do things. It's very cost effective, and then so then around that one plant springs up other things that are part of its supply chain, and so therein lies the risk, and we see this over and over and over again. So the short answer to this is, if we diversify our supply chain and start opening up redundant capability, it's not efficient, it's more expensive. So what we have to make the determination on is the cure more expensive than the illness, and or vice versa. And that's a hard determination, because here we are in 2020s, all this miraculous stuff we're talking about, AI, supercomputing, soon to be quantum computing, et cetera. Our supply chains are no more transparent today than they were 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And there's a logical reason for that too, but that lack of transparency is one of the things that's going to prevent us from making any kind of meaningful headway in terms of mitigating the risk. But supply chains are proprietary, and very few participants in the supply chain are going to be willing to show you who their suppliers are,
Right.
what their costs are. And supply chains are also, it's like a Russian doll. Every link of the supply chain is made up of its own set of supply chains, every link of which is made up of another set of supply chains. So I saw something that McKinsey put out that said the average automotive maker has about 250 first-tier suppliers. So, and their visibility and what they're touching is that first tier. But beneath that, in subsequent tiers is on average another plus 18,000 that they have no knowledge of. They're not touching, and anything in that 18,000 supplier chain that goes wrong, if that particular link or supplier is the only one with it, everything else comes apart. So that really stuck with me. I thought, wow, that's amazing.
That's very, I mean, it's a fraction of a percent of insight, that's crazy,
Yep.
It's crazy.
Hey, Brian, there was something you were asking me about yesterday. I remember you were talking about
Actually,
defense.
Well, I do have a question.
wanna
Well, I do have a question because you mentioned like diversifying your supply chain, right? And I know a while back we talked about sort of nearshoring and offshoring. Do you think with if people diversify, they are, they're going to we talked about Japan, right? They're going to have different regions throughout the world, whether it's nearshore or not nearshore is almost irrelevant, but different regions throughout the world, not just focus into, like you said, usually those things spring up around each other. So not just focus in, say Japan, but focus in Japan and in, Brazil and, just different parts of the world if they do diversify it.
Yeah. So, that when you look at a map of where all the weather events are, and I've got an interesting one from 2019, and I don't remember off the top of my head who produced it, but it's got colored dots for the type of event, and then the size of the dot relates to the size of the economic impact of it. So the thing that jumped out at me when I was looking at this is how clumped up the weather events are where the population is. So, because I was thinking about the question that you asked, Brian, which is, okay, if I wanted to diversify, if I wanted some redundancy, where would I move? And all the logical places have their own set of problems, maybe to a lesser degree, but where we've clumped up as a species tends to be where the weather sucks, is very random and can be very unpredictable. So I don't think there's an easy solution. I mean, if you really want to weatherproof your supply chain, move it to the moon, right?
Which will come with a whole new set of challenges. So
Think about the lead time of travel back and forth.
Yeah, maybe with a space elevator,
that's right.
Reality, we can pull that off.
Yeah. So, I mean, I know what Nicolette was alluding to earlier. We talked about like 5G being one of the things for 2020. You talked about even being for 2021, it being a new thing. Is there any other industries? I was interested. Like, are we going to see some change in what's going on in the defense industry?
Yeah, and we actually have been. I mean, the defense industry for electronics has been very strong, very reliable for years. And because we're modernizing and continue to modernize, and we're looking at robotic soldiers and all kinds of things. So yeah, and we spend a fairly significant portion in terms of real dollars, maybe not in terms of percentage of our GDP in defense, but I mean, it's real money. Um, and it, I guess the best thing I can say about it is it does drive a lot of innovation that shows up in non-defense related stuff. But yeah, I don't think that's going to slow down any. And it in particular is a great driver of our business here at TTI. Um, radar and communications and all kinds of stuff are very dense with electronic components and things that we specialize in. So yeah, the modern soldier, you look at the gear that that they go into battle with these days on the rare instances that they do. It's something else, which is kind of interesting. And this is another thing that I've always found pretty amazing. Think about this for a moment. What is our expectation in war these days? It's that none of our soldiers die. And we've gotten to a point that in a war, the 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 people the death count is small enough that you can actually remember every one of those people. You can list them off, and that's very unusual. Most of our big wars, up into the 20th century, the death toll was massive. And part of what's changed is wars become a lot more precision. And it's one of the reasons why the defense industry in the U.S. is so strong is we are using technology to make what we do more precise, and in the process protect our soldiers and their supply chains. So yeah, I think it's really interesting that whether we've realized it or not, we've come to a point where our expectation is that nobody dies in war. And as weird as this sounds, that the downside to that is, death is a pretty big disincentive, right? So the fact that a lot of people die in war maybe has kept us out of going to war at times. So I don't know, a bloodless war is almost an oxymoron, but yeah, it's another area that tech is changing.
Oh, yeah, and I think sort of back to the point, we were talking about earlier, where you and Nicolette were talking about, like, is it becoming like this technology war that's really replaced, this other type of war in some ways? Is it a war versus a race? Which is interesting.
It is, and one of the places, and maybe Nicolette, you touched on this, that I think in the next couple of years, we're going to see a lot of action. A front line, if you will, to continue this analogy, is in the wafer fab business. You now have a situation where TSMC is the big daddy in the wafer fab business, and they have the leading technology. They're ahead of Samsung. They're ahead of Intel, and obviously they're headquartered in Taiwan, and Taiwan is hotly contested. It's viewed as a territory of China by the Chinese, and this is going to get pretty interesting, and it relates back to our supply chain conversation, because so much of the semiconductor supply chain has clumped up around TSMC. So even now we're experiencing shortages in 8-inch wafers, which is starting to push out lead times and push up pricing on all kinds of stuff. You're seeing price increases in MPUs. You're seeing price increases in FPGAs. You're seeing lead time extensions in a lot of different stuff. So the semiconductor industry adapted this fabless model, and by and large is fabless these days. A big chunk of the silicon that gets consumed comes out of these merchant fabs. And think about the vulnerability there, right? And the leverage that somebody like TSMC has in the industry these days. So it's I tell you, it's going to be really fascinating to see how all this plays out, over the next 10 years. And the next 10 years, the action is just going to be, it's going to be something fast and furious.
And we're going to follow along with you every year. That's it. We're going to all the way into 2030.
That's right. We're making it to 2030.
So you're not going
We're talking about
anywhere.
this every year, Michael.
I'll predict that by long before 2030, we're not going to be doing this through Zoom. We're going to be doing this virtually, with Oculus or something from Microsoft, where it'll actually seem like we're sitting around whatever we want, a campfire, whatever.
Right.
And then the audience will actually will have the same, sensory experience around it. I mean, that we haven't talked about where augmented reality and virtual reality is going.
Mm-hmm.
But that's quickly moving out of gaming into real life industrial applications, and it's going to be a part of how we live, how we travel, how we visit with other people, how we socially interact. It's not going to be this two-dimensional video thing that we're doing now. So by 2030, you guys can check me on this. I bet we're doing this virtually.
That'd be
All
awesome.
right. I'm excited.
I'm
excited. Well, Michael, is there anything else you wanted to leave us with today as we look into the future?
No, just my underlying, I guess, thesis is that it's amazing, going to be highly disruptive, but in disruption is opportunity. So you have to be open to it. You have to be agile.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to be resilient, and you can't take anything for granted. And I guess a big message I have, and something I think about a lot, is as whatever you've done to date that's made you successful. Maybe it's obvious, but going forward, it's no guarantee of continued success. So TTI is next year we celebrate our 50th anniversary. We'll have been around for 50 years. And so we're talking about this a lot, is what's made us successful for the last 50 years going to make it successful for the next 50 years? The answer is some of it, yes, in terms of the culture that we've built and the fact that we're part of Berkshire Hathaway and that kind of thing. But some of it, no, some of it's not going to be applicable.
Mm-hmm.
So this is going to be really interesting times for all businesses, especially a lot of the bigger businesses that have been at it for a while. So that's the but if you go into it with your eyes wide open and fascinated by it, curious about it, I think there's a lot of possibility to actually not just survive, but to thrive. So that's my personal game plan, as well as the game plan here at TTI.
That's great. I love it. Be flexible. Think about it.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Michael. Thank you.
It was my pleasure. I really enjoyed talking to you guys. So I appreciate the opportunity.